Well, thank you very much, and thank you for coming. You know there are puppets next door, right? Like that's a pretty hard thing to compete with. But I'm here today to talk about the work that we do in the graphics department at the New York Times, and that's largely those people in the picture right there. And what we do is we are the people who research and create charts, maps, diagrams, all kinds of things that are both words and pictures for the print newspaper and then for the website too. So we're large. There are about 25 of us in all. There are people who are really excellent reporters, people who are really excellent designers, a handful of cartographers, like just a ton of different backgrounds, and we tend to work together. And so the work that I will talk about today, it's not all my work, it's the work of these people, because there are puppets next door, you know, so I can't compete with that on my own. So where do I fit into this picture? It's kind of an interesting state of the world in sort of news graphics right now. Every year, a bunch of news graphics people like gather in Pamplona, Spain to have like, you know, the biggest conference for news graphics. And one of the themes for like probably 5 years running now is, you know, what is the difference between data visualization and illustration and news graphics, and how do they fit together, and is one of them better than the other one? And so there's a graphics editor in Spain, his name is Cheeky, who's really excellent, and he's one of the few people who can work in both like that data visualization world and the illustration world, like all in one person, which is really interesting. But one of the things that he came away with after this year's big conference was one of the things he said is like, maybe we should have a friendly soccer game between friends of Amanda Cox and friends of Fernando Baptista, who's an excellent illustrator at National Geographic. He makes these like really smart, really thoughtful illustrations that are well annotated. And so that's kind of like those two examples are examples of that. Like what is the difference about, you know, data visualization in news versus illustration in news? And Cheeky, I think, is a really bright guy. He says that like he doesn't really care what form it takes, right? Like as long as you tell a story and you choose a form that's effective for what you're trying to do, then it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter what we're doing. But the claim that I want to make today, right? Like I want to go like just one slight step beyond that, and I want to say that there's a lot of stuff that I could learn, like someone who just wants to like play around with like lines and points in like data visualization world, from the guys on the first page who have spent their career working in 3D and are better illustrators and are, you know, working in the illustration theme of that. And so what do I mean by that? And also what I mean is, like, here's the kind of work that I like to do, right? Like, it's just an unemployment chart largely, right? But if you could just start to filter it and you could say, here's, you know, white people, if we go. There's women, you know, maybe 25 to 44 who are college graduates, right? Like, and if we respond here, all of a sudden you start to see like there's a ton of variation in the, you know, unemployment rates based on just different demographic groups, right? Like you can start to see, you know, maybe there's a different line up there that it's just a completely different world, completely different chart, right? And the claim I want to make is that when you start to make, you know, graphics that look more like this, that there's a lot of lessons there that are exactly the same lessons of the guys that are, you know, doing illustrative work, right? So the same lessons are going on about the guys who, when, you know, Egypt, when there's protesters in the street and they make diagrams of it, right? I think the same kind of idea, and not even just subtle ideas like typography, but ideas about like this idea of something goes in the front, something goes in the back, right? Something is there to provide context, and something is there because that's what you care about the most, right? And so like, you know, we make these little diagrams of like, you know, here are where the protesters were today, and this is what's going on. You know, here, you know, next week, this is what happens. And Graham, the guy who renders this stuff, right, like the buildings, I think, you know, are rendered in this style, not because that's like the best Graham can do, or that's the best Graham can do on deadline in terms of detail, but there's this idea about some detail you want to leave out, right? Like some things should be abstract, like some things aren't important. And so what do we how do we translate those ideas about, like the building doesn't need windows because the windows don't matter, to the world of data viz? And so I think like fundamentally the same question is the same. Like, when we look at data viz, it's like how much detail do we want, or how many background singers? Like I think about like that unemployment chart line. Like I think about, you have the line in the front, and I think of the, the fainter lines in the back for the different demographic groups, as I call them, like, backup singers, right? They're just there to like provide some context, make you sound good, but they don't want to stand in front, right? They just, and there's the same thing I think that's going on with some of the buildings there, right? They're there to give you a sense of scale in the same way that the unemployment line, chart, like 50% to 3%, those kind of things. They're there to like stand in the background, help you figure out where you are, make you sound good, right? And this is like not a new idea at all. At the times, there's kind of mythical stories about like in the Gulf War when people were like drawing helicopters, and people would, draw them so that you could like, every bolt showed up, right? So if you wanted to like take it and like assemble your own helicopter, right? Like this was the diagram for you, right? Like this is how you could, and it's like a question of like, is that really necessary, right? And I think this, I couldn't find the Gulf War 1991 one, so this is one that's from 2003. And it's a little unfair because originally it ran in color, so it doesn't look quite like this, it's not quite as much of a disaster in some editions. In some editions it ran in black and white. But we talk about this kind of like Jurassic Park philosophy, right? You're so busy like trying to figure out whether you can do things that you don't like, stop to think about whether you should do things, right? And I think that the technical illustrators, right, I think at least in the world of, journalism and news graphics that I come, I think that's something that they were playing with, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, kind of the idea of, in that Tahir square diagram, right? Like, I don't need to render all of the detail in the buildings, right? Like I just need to give you the essence of them or something, right? Like I don't need every bolt in the helicopter, like, or in some of the labels on this, right? It says like the labeling is like pilot and it points there, right? Like in a diagram like this is like pilot really the kind of thing that you want to point out. But I think that idea translates like one-to-one, like exactly very clearly to a lot of the data visualization work, and a lot of it is about discipline and about essence and distilling things to what they are, or distilling things such that you show a pattern, right? But there's the converse side of that, where sometimes a lot of detail really helps you. So this is, that helicopter was from 2003, so I went to find like a more like data vizy graphic from 2003, and here's one that it's just about the length of movie credits, right? So like Casablanca is this long, and Star Wars is this long, and they're getting much longer, right? Like not at all like a very complicated or sophisticated idea, right? And the type such that, the names of all these people, it's not, I can't read it, like, it's a print graphic, how it was conceived, that's why it's so long, right? Like, so it's not like I could zoom in even if I wanted to. But I think that idea shows up a lot in data viz, right? Like it's that the idea of the data is there rather than what you see it yourself. But so those kind of ideas, like I think there's like a one-to-one mapping, right? Like, so the question is, right, like I argue in this case, right, this detail that I can't even read, like it makes this graphic interesting, right? Like if it were just 5 bars, like it somehow loses its appeal entirely, right? Or if it were just a sentence, right, you could just say this in a sentence just as well, right? Like, there are a lot of people who are credited with The Lord of the Rings, it was a complicated movie to make, right? Like, not so sophisticated of idea, but somehow the detail makes it interesting, right? And so then I think the question is like, how much detail? And, the best answer to that, or at least in my opinion, is like, it's totally unsatisfactory, but the answer is really like some kind of like, show a pattern, leave some detail. It's some kind of like, weird Goldilocks, like some porridge is just the right temperature, right? Like, and that's what you're shooting for. Like you want kind of like both of those things to happen at the same time. And that's not really a new idea at all, right? Like in the, a good data viz often works simultaneously on different levels. So you have the like macro pattern and you have something interesting. And I don't think it's a new idea in the world of journalism at all either, right? Like, when people, reporters at the New York Times write stories, they'll often, start with an anecdote or, move to an anecdote in the center. So like, have this pattern and it's about billions or trillions or some kind of like number that's large enough that it just means large, right? So it's like I have something that's about like 7 large, and then I tell you about like Greg in California, and all of a sudden it like makes it easier to care, right? And so I think this idea is exactly the same thing. And so let me show you like one example where I think that was successfully worked out.
Mariano Rivera is one of the most dominant closers in history. But what may be most remarkable is that he has done it by confounding hitters with mostly one pitch, his signature cutter. John Flaherty of the Yes Network faced Rivera as a hitter and also caught him when he played for the Yankees.
From a hitter standpoint, he's out on the mound. It feels like he's not even putting any effort into it, and the ball explodes on you. And from a catching standpoint, he's the easiest guy ever to catch because he throws the ball right where you want it.
Rivera uses a seemingly effortless delivery, which he can flawlessly repeat, pitch after pitch. His cutter is thrown very much like a fastball, but the pitch has significant lateral movement. He creates and adjusts this movement with the different pressure he puts on the ball with his fingers. The pitch's lateral movement keeps it off the bat's sweet spot, moving in on the hands of a left-handed batter and toward the end of the bat of a righty. To a hitter, Rivera's cutter first appears like a straight fastball, making it hard to distinguish the two pitches during the first fractions of a second when the hitter must decide if, when, and where to swing. Hitters often rely on reading a pitch's spin to determine what pitch is coming, but Rivera's fastball and cutter have what appear to the hitter as the same spin. Many pitchers throw their cutters more like sliders, with their fingers pulling down on the side of the ball. This can create more downward and lateral movement than a cutter, but it also creates the signature spin of a slider, a spinning red dot, that the hitter can recognize and adjust to. With identical deliveries and spins on Rivera's pitches, hitters are at a loss to identify and then attack the pitch, until it is too late, and the balls end up in very different locations. Here are the nearly 1,300 pitches that Rivera threw in 2009, each frozen at the point when the batter must make his swing decisions. But with few clues to determine the pitch's ultimate location, the batter can be faced with guessing at these outcomes. Here are the cutters to left-handers. Here are the cutters to right-handers. And fastballs to right-handers. He throws almost no fastballs to lefties. As this map of his 2009 pitches shows, Rivera is remarkably adept at hitting the corners, keeping the ball away from the middle of the plate, the easiest spot for a batter to make good contact.
Looking from this perspective, it's not surprising that the real hot spot is inside on a lefty. I think he could hit that spot with his eyes closed.
Rivera's simple but effective formula has made him baseball's most dominant closer.
And so that is an example of a graphic where I think it's really super interesting to me, right? Because in some ways, it doesn't do, to me at least, such a great job of explaining, why is Mariano Rivera the world's most dominating closer, right? Like in some ways, it would be more effective to say, his cutter moves this much on average, and let's compare that to the next 20, the 20 next best closers or whatever, right? But there's some idea about the idea of, can I see something I understand, right? So I can see one baseball pitch. I know exactly what that is. I know exactly what the detail there is. But then there's this also, I don't think those are as effective as when you see the pattern, right? Like if the pattern by itself is not as effective without the underlying detail. Like this baseball cloud, it's cool. It's way cooler than, the red heat map. And that's because you can see, you can attach yourself to, I know exactly what that pitch is, right? Like it corresponds to something that he threw at one point. But at the same level, the baseball cloud by itself, doesn't really tell you as much as perhaps the pattern does, right? So it's this idea of, can we move back and forth between the individual data points and some kind of aggregation of them that I think is helpful. But at the same time, I don't think always that, it's not enough just to say oh, I showed a pattern, right? And so here is, our example of what we did at the last House election, right? So these are House election results, who won each House district, right? House district maps are hard because you've got these, they're weirdly shaped and they're oddly gerrymandered, and my House district is so small you can't even see it, and Montana is ginormous, right? And so you've got kind of all of these classic problems, and you say what else could we do, right? Maybe instead of coloring them, I'll let you show districts, or maybe instead of letting you show districts, I'll let you only show, districts with a certain percentage of college graduates. So, you can throw all these kind of, filters and other sorts of layers on top of things. But my favorite house results map is something that we call it our big board, right? Where we throw away something, right? We throw away the geography of a house map, which is kind of a crazy idea, right? Let's make a house map and we'll throw away geography, right? But I think part of that throwing away is a lot of and sort of it's like what it means to be a grown-up, right? Like when you decide, like, I can't be an astronaut and a president and a mom all at the same time, right? Like, you gotta like kind of like shut some doors and like, figure out what it is you're trying to do. And so this is an example where, we've taken the same data that's on the house map. I think it's actually the same text file. And the guys who built this one have rendered it instead. So instead of showing you the geography of a house map, which like to most of us means very little anyway, we've sorted them by what our political reporters think is going to happen. So Democrats are expected to win easily, so this column is mostly blue. Here are the ones where they couldn't decide. Here's what Republicans were expected to win narrowly and Republicans easily. So we've just sorted the House districts by, by what our political reporters think are going to happen, right? And if you scroll down, this is my favorite example, right? Like this is Jim Oberstar in Minnesota 8. And it's a surprise, right? Like he's been served in Congress for like 36 years, and it's debatable about why he lost, whether it was changing demographics in that district, or it was his healthcare vote, or who knows why he lost. But this, this point is interesting, right? Like, and so I think it's really important to choose a form that surfaces interesting things, right? Like you can see it. You see that here as well, right? Like this striped shape says, Jim Oberstar lost this race, right? But there's no idea of that's super interesting, or that's a surprise, or that's something that we should really care about. And so, for us, we think that we like the big board like way more than the world likes the big board, right? Like the world is quite not ready for this, but even though it's just a little table. But the idea that you can surface interesting things if you throw something away, or if you use the right form, or if you show a different pattern. So here's one more example of that. Here's different election results. This is 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, when Clinton and Obama were, in the middle of their super long primary race, right? Their primary went on and on and on. And so instead of saying, like, let's show you how classically we would show election results, right? Like, or exit polls. Exit polls often come in either like a table, or maybe it's a little bar chart, right? What if we just throw away a bunch of that data and just reshape it by state? So here, each square is a different state, right? And so you can see how men voted. Women favored Clinton at the time. Blacks favored Obama. Whites favored Clinton, and you can do the same thing. You can watch it step across by age, right? Like you can step across. Older people are headed more towards Clinton. And my favorite one is always by education, right? So no college on the stronger Clinton side. Some college moves towards Obama. College grads favor Obama even more. And then you've got the post-grads, and then this is the one I like. It's kind of like the Jim Oberstar is the equivalent, right? In Arkansas, like I think all of the people who have super educated people, like they're like personal friends of the Clintons, right? Like, and so like you see the outlier. But it's another, this example is just another example of ways where like the shape itself means something, right? Like the idea of this like cluster of states moving together, right? Like it means something, but there's also something interesting that happens in the details. My favorite recent example of that is probably this one, where this is something that John Wong, who wasn't in that first picture because he's a member of our multimedia department, made after bin Laden died, right? And so he set up a scatter plot and let New York Times readers fill it in, right? Is your emotional response negative or positive? And how significant of an event do you think it is? Is it significant or is it not significant? And people could leave their comment and people could say, how they felt. And so it works on kind of like a macro level. You can see that, at least most of the New York Times readers who are filling this thing in think it's a significant positive event, and you can read them to various effect as well. But so you can drill down to see the micro level as well as the macro picture of how people are thinking. There's one thing that I think in an ideal world with the right time and the right resources that I think could have made this graphic even better, and that's if we had added the dots for 7 people whose opinions matter. Not that like Lauren in Astoria or Tim in Minneapolis doesn't matter, but in the same way that people who have caught Mariano Rivera, their opinion counts more than someone who lives in their basement, right? Like it just it matters more. Or maybe that someone lives in their basement is an Al Qaeda scholar, so then their opinion starts to count more, right? Like it's the idea of how can we infuse this with a little bit of reporting? But I think it's overall I think it's really effective in this idea of macro, micro at the same time. But what I think it also tells us is one of the things I also think I know, and I think can be learned from illustrative work, is that the annotation layer is the most important thing we do. It's something that is super important. And so I'll give you one more video that kind of illustrates that in a diagrammatic sense.
I'm Henry Fountain, a science reporter for the New York Times. Ryan St. Ange, a freestyle aerial skier, and I are going to be breaking down his performance of what's called a double full full full. That's a triple backflip with 4 body twists. It's a jump he may attempt at the Winter Olympics in Vancouver.
As you approach the jump, you want to have your eyes up and you want to be as tall as possible.
Ryan wants to be going about 30 miles an hour at the end of the takeoff ramp, which will send him 55 feet in the air. At takeoff, gravity and the force of the ramp act on him to create torque that starts him rotating backward. By raising his arms, he increases his rotational inertia. He moves more of his weight away from the center of rotation, which is near the hips. Given the speed he's traveling at the end of the ramp, this increased inertia results in greater rotational momentum, or what you might call flipping power, as he leaves the ramp. In contact twisting, Ryan initiates a twist simply by pushing off with the legs at the end of the ramp. In a hula move, he creates a twisting motion by rotating the hips as if using a hula hoop. Often Ryan will start with a back arch, thrusting the hips forward, and then rotate the hips in one direction by moving to a side arch. The twisting occurs in the direction opposite to the hip rotation. Tilt twisting uses arm movements to cause the body to tilt to one side. Lowering the left arm, for example, causes a tilt to the right. Since Ryan is rotating backward, around an axis that's roughly through his hips, the tilt transfers some of this rotational momentum to an axis that runs head to toe, causing him to spin or twist. The more tilt, the more twist.
And this is the part where you just hang on. You just go for the ride. You're twisting as fast as you can. You're trying to bring your arms in as tight to your body.
Ryan needs to complete 2 full twists in his first backward flip. So after starting the twist, he draws his arms closer to his body. This makes him more compact, decreasing his rotational inertia along the axis that runs from his head to his toes. Here, a principle called conservation of rotational momentum applies. He has less inertia, but momentum remains constant. The result? He spins faster.
As you can see at this point in the jump, I'm looking at the ground. I'm very straight, very tall, trying to make my body line as pretty as possible for the judges, but also at the same time trying to measure how far I am away from the ground, how much flip rotation I have, and at this point you can start to see my arms raise above my head to slow down my flip so that I elongate my body and have more time in the air before I hit the ground.
So I love that when they talk about annotation layer, because in some ways, like, the annotation is not so sophisticated, right? Like, it's like Ryan raises his arms, and it shows you where arms are. Like, that was something that you needed help with. And there's a similar one about why Merce Cunningham is what his choreography is like in ballet, and it says something about toes, and it shows you where the toes are, right? Like, it's not some super deep, super complicated thing, but on another level, it is a super deep, super complicated thing, right? Like, it is having someone tell you hey, this is what you should pay attention to right now, I think is very useful and very helpful of an idea, right? Now watch his arms, now watch his hula move, right? This idea of tell me what I should look at, I think is very successful when we're trying to communicate to people something that they might not already know, right? When I watch that one, I don't know anything about aerial skiing other than it's awesome, right? And I can walk away with it and actually know something more than that it's just awesome, right? If we just want to know it's awesome, we might as well just watch videos because they would probably be quicker and awesomer, right? But this idea of how can we use the annotation layer to help us understand things that we might not already see. And so we try to borrow ideas from that. So this is a diagram that there's a computer scientist in Germany who makes these kind of lovely tree map things about So I sent them some data about inflation in the US, right? Like how much stuff do people buy? Like how much does it count? So like the big shapes are things like rent, and then the little shapes are things like cheese or whatever, right? Like, and then they're colored according to like how fast the prices are changing in those things. And we can choose things like we do things like say like here is the reason that food is rising quickly is because of oil, or like not super sophisticated sentences, but I still think they're super helpful. And I think they're even more helpful when instead of talking about like cell phones and shoes, which are like something you relatively know about, when you start to like break out into things that are slightly more complicated, right? When instead of like mapping like what do people buy, you map like what is the federal budget, right? Like, so I probably don't need you to tell me that like rice belongs in the food category, right? But if we're going to start to talk about like where does the home heating program fall or whatever, right? With the annotation layer becomes something like super important and super helpful. Here's another example, kind of like diagrammatically, like kind of a breaking news diagram that I think the same exact principles apply. This one's from a few years ago, and a crane collapsed, right? So we say like second time in 2 months, a crane has collapsed. This is what a crane looks like. Cranes can spin, basically, right? It can move up and down. Here's something that happened, right? Like, unlike the last time, this one, the top part fell off this time. And, it fell to the ground, and a couple of people died. So it's not like, I think the idea about like annotation layer, here's what I'm supposed to be looking at, right? Like, and it's not so necessary to say like, this is what a crane is. But when you start to think like, here's about the kind of movement that you might want to think about what this crane means or how you understand it, like same principle, like, so this is a chart that the OECD makes, right? And so our role in this is that can we take a chart like the OECD makes, right? For the New York Times, like we're pretty conservative people, like this is kind of crazy, right? And so like, can we take this, can we break it apart in the exact same way that we break apart the diagrammatic stuff? So can we take a chart like this and deconstruct it in the same way that we deconstruct a crane accident? So we say, we're going to make a chart about business cycles, right? We're going to transform some industrial production, whatever series, and we're just going to fold it on itself in weird ways, right? If we do that, here's what it looked like from the 1960s to 1973. And this like big circle means the economy was super volatile, right? A little circle means it was not as volatile, right? We have a mild cycle. As we come into the current period, like people thought we wouldn't have volatile cycles anymore. There were these little tiny blips, but we thought we could bounce back easily. And it turns out now we look like this. This is how we look at this. Or if you add leading indicators in it, here's what it means to be a leading indicator. It means you're the arrow that gets chased, right? Like by the economy. And so I think it's the same idea, but it's the idea that instead of just handing people the chart and saying like, best of luck in this endeavor, right? Like, can I hold your hand a little bit and say like, hey, come with me. This is pretty cool, right? And I think that like the idea of an annotation layer is super important for like journalistic products, for the sort of space that I live in. Sometimes that gets kind of hard though, right? Like, and so here's an example of a graphic that we made about like, where do people rent different Netflix videos? One of our computer-assisted reporters, called Netflix and just kept calling week after week to say like, hey, could I get that data? Could I get that data? How's it going? I wonder if you had that data. And so we have it, right? We have Netflix rental zip codes for every zip code in the country, like the top 50 of them, right? And Joe has spent a lot of time getting this data, and so we want to do something interesting with it. Like we've invested a lot of effort in this data. So the idea is, sure, we can make you a map of the country and say like, let me help you like browse this, right? But I think it's super important at the bare minimum to say like, here are at least 3 things that we think are interesting. In New York, Mad Men looks like this. Obsessed, which is a Beyonce movie, looks like this. You know, Last Chance Harvey, which is Dustin Hoffman being sad, looks like this, right? Like, and so, like, at the bare minimum, I think what we need to do is, you know, write these, we call them readouts, which is the text at the top that, like, you know, very basic level tells you, like, hey, here's something interesting you can find. And my favorite Minneapolis one is there's a New in Town is a movie like Renee Zellweger comes from like big city and is like transformed by the charms of Minnesota, which is also transformed by her or something, right? And so you can totally see like in most cities, like, you know, the city center like totally clears out, right? Like we're like snobs and whatever, right? In Minneapolis, like in all of Minnesota, right? The movie is about Minnesota. You could see it kind of like that, but we can feel like, I think we can feel snobs today because we're in one of these like not top 50 zip codes in the very center, right? But there are interesting patterns that you can see in these things, and with a little bit of context about like, oh, that's a movie about Minnesota, right? Like you could, I think, draw out even more interesting patterns. So we try to do that, and like we've had a little bit of success sometimes with like pushing that burden onto other people, right? Like especially about space, right? Like you know about the place where you live. It's one of those things like how you can always like talk about weather in the elevator or whatever. You know, like everyone has at least something to say about where they live or what it is. And so, you know, when the census release came out, you know, we'd just come off having a lot of success with the like, you balance the budget, share your plan on Twitter, right? And so I think we tried to, you know, pull it out again for, you know, you can make all kinds of census maps about any part of the country that you want. You know, there's dozens of them. You can do all kinds of things. And we prompted you to say, like, you know, my census map shows whatever, right? And I think largely, like, when given that prompt, you know, we culled, you know, 50 of the best ones, and at least like 30 of these are like I would consider like pretty mediocre, right? And so I think when you give to people too much, when you push too much of the burden on someone to say like, hey, you figure it out, like I made it, but it's your problem to like figure out what this is, like we end up with things that are, you know, possibly not as cool as they could be. And I think, you know, I think the maps are great. Like I think, you know, the visualization of like how stunningly segregated parts of the country are. This is just a map of race, you know, and so green dots are 200 white people, blue dots are 200 black people, and so on. Like the amount of segregation in a lot of these cities is really, you know, really super interesting. But when people, you know, when we prompt our readers who I think are, you know, generally educated, literate, like people, like even among the best ones, I would say like probably like 10% of the things that people think they found, right, like are not really true, right? Like they're like interpreting the map in like a not like a proper way or whatever, right? And so sometimes we will think like, you know, how can I do that for you? How can I, like, you know, here's an example of, you know, BLS data about what do people do all day long. And I think there are like interesting, you know, there are interesting things in this that are not entirely obvious, but there are a lot of obvious things too, right? You know, employed people go to work, unemployed people don't go to work, right? Like employed people get up in the morning, unemployed people don't get up in the morning, right? Like not super, like duh, right? Like, you know, front page stop presses, right? Like not exactly. But I think there are also interesting things about that you can see, right? You know, things that I wouldn't have guessed, right? Like the average unemployed person spends a half hour a day looking for a job, right? Like it's not a pattern that, you know, in the context I would have necessarily expected. Or, you know, how does, you know, TV vary by age, right? Or whatever, you know, you just get older and watch more and more TV, or, you know, you get older and eat more and more breakfast, right? It goes away, right? But, and so we try, like, you know, we've tried to say like, hey, let me do the work for you, right? Like, and I will write these sentences for you, but it still ends up feeling like a little bit of a scavenger hunt, right? Like, and I think we very much do not want to make scavenger hunts. We do not want to make things where like the interesting things surface. And I think that's slightly more problematic than it is online than it is in print. I think in print this was a successful graphic that showed you, you know, some interesting things about unemployed people and like, you know, myths. Are they really like, you know, spending all day in school, or what do they volunteer more? Do they go to church more? Like all kinds of interesting things. But I think The danger online when you don't show a fair amount of discipline is it just becomes like a free-for-all. And so, I will end with this last idea that, nothing important is ever headlined, here is some data, hope you find something interesting. Or like in the new world, like, here is some data, hope you find something interesting. If you do, could you tweet about it, right? Or, please let me know, right? Like, I think that very, pushing that onto other people is, a little bit of a mistake. And I don't mean that entirely in the sense that there needs to be a proper annotation layer. So a graphic like this, damage after Japan, the tsunami, what did some of these places look like, before the tsunami and after the tsunami, right? And I think kind of what I would think of as the classic annotation layer, this idea that here we're looking at Sendai and let me tell you a little bit about that. That's totally the least important part, right? The annotation is really involved in the editing and the selection of what are the things that we look at and what are the things that you should be looking at, as opposed to just saying here's an interface, go ahead and browse for the rest of your life, right? To get a sense of the scale, to get a sense of discretion. But on the same news event, right? I think the same thing, there are certainly news events where annotation is critical, right? If I'm gonna wanna understand something about nuclear physics, right? I'm gonna need you to have a little help in that endeavor, right? And it's the same idea with some of the data viz I showed, right? If I wanna understand Netflix rentals in my zip code, right? I probably don't need so much help, right? If I want to understand when do people eat and sleep on average, right? I probably can be sent off on my own, right? But when I want to do slightly more complicated things, slightly more important things, I don't know, depending on your level of importance, I'm gonna need some help in the annotation layer. I'm gonna need you to hold my hand and give you a tour a little bit. And so I think that's, to me at least, figuring out where that goes and how that works with interactivity, is one of the super important things for data viz in a journalism sort of kind of environment. So that's about all that I have. If you want to, we push out a couple of things that at least we think are interesting, maybe 1 or 2 a week on Twitter, and that's me. And I left a little time for questions if you have them. Yeah.
You mentioned bringing out interesting points in the way that you visualize the data, and it seemed like in at least a couple of the examples, the interesting points were outliers. Can you talk a little bit about the relevance of outliers relative to sort of other patterns that maybe are more evident in the data?
I mean, I think kind of coming from journalism, outliers are super interesting, right? There's probably a story in every outlier just explaining, why does that happen? There's certainly also stories in kind of trends, and especially there, you want to say, how has this changed over time, or how is it different than it used to be? But I think one of the most powerful things about visualization is that ability to identify outliers, right? If you just want to figure out what the average is, right? You probably don't need to look at a bunch of different points, right? The average is 57. I know that the average is 57. But the strength of data visualization, I think, is the putting it in context so that you can see clearly, something interesting is going on here. Or maybe it's not interesting, maybe it's just whatever, right? But I think there's definitely the role of outliers in journalism. When we write about quirky people or quirky places, right? That's kind of what we're doing, the same thing here. So I think both totally have merit. Do I want to show you some kind of trend, or do I want to show you that something is the opposite of the trend, right?
Thanks, that was really fascinating. And as a journalist, I've got a couple of questions that I just wanted to ask you. One is about time frame. I mean, about just how quickly you're able to, get some of these up and running. And do you tend to revisit when you have been doing a really quick, response to a news story? And the other is just about, and it's picking up on Maritz's point to some extent, which is about, how is that process driven? How are you coming to those ideas about what it is that you are hoping to achieve, to do, or surface?
Sure. So the first question, I think, the answer is totally unsatisfactory, but the real answer is that it just varies. So a couple of the, breaking news projects that we looked at, the crane collapse, that's something that's done in an afternoon. The, nuclear diagrams are something that's done that weekend when it happens, or the, election results can stretch over over months, right? Like, people are thinking about how are we going to shape these and how are we going to like worry about load time so that it's, the very fancy, like kind of high end. But I would say like on average, a lot of the stuff I showed today was probably like a week of time, like somewhere, 2, 3 people, usually most of stuff, like, probably 80% of the work is done by a small group of 2 or 3 people, and then like, there may be 3 more names on it because we needed a sentence writer at the end, or someone did some reporting at the beginning, or, like all kinds, it varies on the kind of the size or the scope of things, but, generally not so much more than a week, except for the super fancy stuff like elections or whatever that are very tricked out. I think the second question, to me at least, I think it's the same kind of idea of what Moritz spoke about, and something that I think Casey and Ben and when they spoke about the same thing this morning about the importance of sketching with data. I think a lot of it about like trying on different like hats, or I think you think you have your like form party over here and you have your data party and you like try to introduce them to each other. And so for me, like I can never like I'm just not smart enough to figure out what things are going to look like without like seeing them, right? Like, and so I think it's just super quick to just try on, especially for the pure data viz, right? Can we try on a bunch of different forms? Can we, I'll show you one, like the arrows that we started with. It's kind of large. This is a PDF of about 75 different ways that you could look at election results. And we just take the data and start, manipulating it. Here's if we put them as dots instead of squares. What if we do arrows? What if we do something even weirder, right? What if I'm poor, so I have to use poor man's animation, right? Like, what if we try that out? What if we like throw away the geography and turn towards boxes, right? Not really working, not really working, not really working. What if we do some kind of aggregation, right? So instead of trying to show you all of the shifts in all of the races, what if we show you the average or the median or something? By state, what does that look like? What if we just focus on the districts that switched, because that's a more manageable number than 435, that's okay. Like, what if we reduce, but that's too much space for print, right? Like, I'm never going to get that amount of space in print. So what if I reduce those bar charts down to like something simpler, right? So instead of showing you a bar, I just show a color. That's not bad, and it's even better like in the context of all the other races. So here's like the 2000 election, 2002, 4, 6, 8, 10, and so when it flips color, it flip party, right? Like, so there's a bunch of districts that are like really solidly Democratic. That's better, that has potential, but it's still like a little weird, right? Now we start to like break out the pencils because we're like crumpling things and getting frustrated, right? So the guy who drew this, like, we looked at those, arrows at the beginning, right? But they were all kind of like weird and they didn't really make sense, and so someone drives by and says, like, what if you move the arrows back to the map? You can tell he doesn't live in Texas because it's missing at the bottom. But, real paper sketches, like the idea of, like, I think that's another idea from, the guys who do illustrative work, like the idea of the importance of, like, really sketching with this stuff, So that's what that looks like, right? Like, this is with a shift in this last election with dummy data, pretend data about how we think the election's going to go, right? What if you take that and compare that to the last 3 elections? That starts to be more interesting, right? We'll put it like weird colors on it so it's easier to clean up in Illustrator, and then that ends up being the election section cover, right? And I don't think you get to like weird like wind shift arrows on a map unless you work through a few different forms, right? Like, and so I think like this is a good example of just trying on things and like combining them together till you find something that works.
Yeah, super interesting. I wonder, some of these things like the crane falling over, that was in a moment in time and there was a visualization you would do and at the end it's all kind of sealed up. But there are other visualizations I've seen the New York Times do. There are things about ongoing events that are clearly journalistically interesting and ongoing, like deaths in Iraq, for example. And there you have data from the beginning up to that moment in time when you publish. But do you ever think about standing up a visualization that then lives on beyond that so that I can come in 1, 2, 3 years later and see how it's going and continue to annotate and put this annotation layer on that thing because you told a story
Yeah.
the first time you published it, but you might want to keep telling or retelling or tell a different story later on. Does that ever
Yeah.
enter into how you build these things?
I mean, we do certainly think about that, and there's a team of like news developers who I think tend to focus more than the graphics department on these things that are like, live and breathe and are ongoing indefinitely. Like, so we do certain things like, War Deaths is certainly one that has been, was updated for a very long time, and we've done things like, Oil Tracker, like in the Gulf oil spill, we updated that map every single day. But, it's hard to keep the annotation relevant, right? Like we talk about it often as like babies to feed, right? Like, you can't have so many babies to feed at one time. It just becomes distracting and like, but, for important news events, like, and it's not so hard often to like feed data into something to keep it live. But I think the idea of the, the annotation layer is like, there's one that like, we've worked on sometimes like baseball records or things, right? Like, so it's totally easy to like, with baseball reference or whatever, to have that data feed be ongoing, right? But then when you've like written these sentences that say like, hey, this is the interesting part, right? Like, whoever has the most walks per whatever, and this is important because whatever, right? Like, all of a sudden that stops being true at some point, and so then you become like out of line with like the data and the annotation, and so I think it's really like a difficult question about like how do you live update the annotation layer in a smart way that takes no effort, right? But like that's the problem, right? Like smart takes effort, right? So it's kind of
So how do you decide how successful something you've designed and built is?
I mean, I think success is kind of like a really interesting question, but there's a Robert Frost quote about his poems that I really like. He says like, it starts in delight and ends in wisdom, right? And like I think that's like not a bad framework for success. I mean, that's a little hard for my blood, right? Like maybe it starts in mild intrigue and ends in knowing something, right? But like both of those, both of those at the same time are, it's not so hard to make stuff. I don't think that like looks kind of cool, and it's not so hard to make stuff that like conveys some kind of information, but like the joint of those. And so to me, I think of that like, in a different way we say it, we talk about being clear and compelling, like both of those. So like, and that's not like a metric that like is satisfactory in the way that like page views are satisfactory, or in the way that like my senator called is satisfactory, or whatever, but I think there are like, we don't focus really on any kind of, firm metric about success other than like how sad I feel when I ride home or whatever, right? Like it's very arbitrary. It's kind of, but I think that is all the time that I have, but thank you very much.